Making Sure Yu-Gi-Oh! Here, bringing you another deck profile post Legacy of Destruction. We are here with Austin, who has played Voiceless Voice at a local event this weekend and took first place. So we are going to go ahead and get that profile. Chuck?
So starting off, I wanted to kind of play low to the ground. For me, the most important thing I had was just basically the concept of the deck having a lot of hand traps. I looked at different variants of the deck and I realized that yes, there are merits to both the fusion version as well as the melodious version, but I wasn't comfortable with the melodious version post Legacy Destruction. I didn't have enough time. So I wanted to go with a ground that I was very familiar with, as well as one that was just very consistent at doing what needed to be done, because to me the biggest fear I had was a Tempai matchup. So in that, like in the spirit of that, we play the best out we have to Tempai, which is 2 Skull Guardian. Skull Guardian being able to activate during damage step means that a lot of times what you can do is you can pop the field spell, and you can put them on a situation if they gotta have either the continuous or the complete spell to continue extending, or you have Skull Guardian to negate the monster that is the main deck monsters that they will try to use their effects during the battle phase. Now this doesn't always work out. A lot of times board breakers are ensuing, so you have to bring the Skull Guardian early. But if you can kind of sequence your plays correctly with your hand traps, which is the main focus of the deck, then you're able to pretty effectively hold Tempai and try and get yourself a second turn. After 2 Skull Guardian, you play 2 copies of Sylvanas. Sylvanas is not really for Tempai or for Branded. This is mainly for the Snake Eyes Fire King matchup. So many of their cards have an inherent summon similar to Kashtira, and you need to hit stuff like Promethean Princess, Fire Charmer Hida, because you are, like in this deck I did make some changes compared to what I normally would run, because I was comfortable using this guy to stop stuff like Hida. It's very helpful when you want to dodge targeting protection, and when you do ritual summon this, it comes in clutch against exactly that matchup. But if you're not in that matchup, you'll instead most likely will be using this as ritual fodder or protection. And the final ritual monster is the Saphira. To me, Saphira is a pretty underrated card that doesn't get the rep that it really should. Like, there's so many things about this card that is just broken. You being able to summon this during your turn and during your opponent's turn pretty easily leads to you drawing 4 cards. And with those 4 cards, you basically discard 2, but most of the time with this deck, there's a lot of cards in your hand that you genuinely don't need. Like, I don't a lot of time need the second ritual spell. I don't a lot of time need this second diviner. Discarding these cards and giving yourself the opportunity to draw 2 hand traps is how you fight Tempai and Snake Eyes in a competitive setting for me, as well as its ability to add a Factor Healer back from the graveyard if this card makes it till the end phase of the next turn. Not in this most likely situation happen. Most of the time they'll sack it off for something, but there are sparse cases where I will deliberately try my best to keep this card alive just so I can start adding hand traps back from my grave. And then we play 3 of the star of the show. We play 3 low. It's just so effective. The biggest problem this deck has is there are times where when you brick, you brick pretty bad. There's not like salvageable brick. It's just you're gonna have to pass turn with a hand trap or something. Low being the best starter in the deck outside of maybe 1, it's just so effective to have happen. It allows you to basically grind your opponent to dust with the new continuous spell. This deck can grind against Snake Eyes, it can grind against Branded really easily, and against most other rogue decks. And that's why I felt comfortable taking this into a situation where it was basically just me grinding against my opponent, and I felt comfortable enough that I could generally outplay them. Then we have 3 of the best starter in the deck, which is 3 Diviner. Diviner is better than low, because the Diviner not only leads to low with an extra piece of ritual fodder, which you will generally use to make either Sephiroth, or you will use to make Saphira. That way you can get that draw 2, discard 1. Though my favorite thing about Diviner is actually using it to out floodgates. Like if you get stuck under something like a deck lockdown, a lot of times Diviner can actually lead, because you'll activate Diviner and most people will be like, okay, that's fine, and you send Elder Entity Entis to grave. We then play 3 copies of Saphira. Saphira is great if you, like, some people have tried cutting this to 2. I don't really understand the logic. If you get hand trapped, which is everywhere in this format, and you hard open Saphira, it allows you to extend way past what most decks are capable of really stopping you on. To me, this is the best comfortability slot in the deck. You discard this from hand, you foolish the ritual spell for protection in case you get board broken against stuff like Tempai. and you have it for follow-up, as well as a couple other plays with Ritual Fodder due to the new continuous spell. Just an efficient card. You then play 1 copy of Sephiroth. Never play more than 2 or more than 1 of this. I don't really understand people's reasoning. You can very effectively put this back in hand and constantly loop it so that you can keep activating Sephiroth. Because Sephiroth's biggest problem is you need the ritual spells in deck to send a grave. This guy will allow you to put the ritual spells back into the deck. And there's just some tiny synergies that allow him to go for damage for lethal, but it's just something you desperately need, as well as just basically give you a good Tenpai matchup. He's not especially great against Tenpai, but Snake Eyes does not have many outs to this card that don't lead to them losing an enormous amount of resources because of it. We then play Diviner's Partner in Crime. We play Charatica. This is how you basically tribute off Diviner. You'll normal Diviner, send this to grave, use its quick effect. If you don't need to use it to tribute Diviner, I suggest holding it, because when you eventually get low in rotation, a lot of people, if you don't have Severus, you can tribute low to allow you to dodge stuff like Effect Veiler and Imperm. I had to do it one time during the event against, I can't remember what the deck was, but you basically just hold the Severus and you tribute Diviner with your ritual spell, and then that will allow you to keep this card in grave in case you ever get Effect Veiler, so that low can basically just guaranteed resolve. Then we play 3 copies of Barrier. This is going to be basically the thing that holds the lines. The best part of this deck is not only its grindability. This card on the field makes it to where your light monsters can't be targeted for card effects. And most decks, like Fire King, which needs Promethean Princess for their grind matchup, is how you hold on, because this makes it to where you have a relatively interesting fire matchup. It's not super clean going second, but if you play this deck going second and you hand trap them the right way, it is very possible for you to walk away with a W. And this card is how. Against Kashtira, it's very helpful because they can't banish your monster. They have to banish this to get any sort of value. So Fenrir has to eat a low, or Fenrir has to eat a barrier. And a lot of times this makes it to where you're low and your Skull Guardian can just resolve free. Once per turn, you can add any Voiceless card from your deck to your hand. Most commonly it will be Saphira. If you have Saphira in hand, what I like to do is lead with Saphira so you can hold this for future plays, and your opponent will be baited to do hand traps early. The biggest skill thing for me in this deck is when you know you're going to play in the hand trap format, you need to sequence your hands in the most offensive way possible, where you're trying to either get to Sephiroth for targeting protection, or play and try and bait Ash Blossom and Droll and Lockbird. Droll and Lockbird, for me, I figured was going to try and fall out of the format a little bit, because it's not good against Tenpai at all, so I didn't think anyone was going to main deck it. So in game 1, I got super greedy and would deliberately try and force my opponent to waste their Ash Blossoms so that I could barrier effect and continue my combo. Then we played Droll's best friend, Pre-Prep. So pre-preparation of Right is the reason why Cerberus is so important. If you go pre-prep, you can add basically pre-prep plus any level 7 or higher monster is full combo if your opponent doesn't have a hand trap. So it also is very helpful because if your opponent doesn't have a hand trap, most of the time they burn it either to stop this pre-prep so you can do other combos, or before the pre-prep. So you'll go pre-prep, get your plays going, and then you'll Sephiroth shuffle back pre-prep and the ritual spell. That way you can summon him, and then you can use the continuous trap to just pop, instead of having to waste it to summon Sephiroth. We then play 2 copies of the ritual spell. You play 2 copies because you don't want 3, because in reality you never really want to open this card. You want 1 copy for pre-prep, 1 copy for Saphira, no more, no less. Because the worst hands this deck can have is where you open 2 of the ritual spell and any pre-preps. Because now you have 3 cards that are dead. And that is how you lose. And that is why I have a huge issue with bricking. It's extremely rare. I did the math. It only happens approximately, I think it was 0.5% of the time to about 1.5%, because of some things I did. But it was really freaking annoying when it did happen. Because it requires you to open ritual spell, pre-prep, and theoretically a second pre-prep for you to not get any value. Plus you not opening Sephiroth to put them back into the deck. Less likely than it sounds. We then play 1 copy of the new continuous spell. This is why you have an interesting Tenpai matchup. They just turn that around. So this allows you to Once per turn, add a monster or add a Voiceless Voice card from your graveyard or banish pile back to your hand so you can play around Shifter. Because this allows you, even though your Sephiris gets, she doesn't get value off of her effect, you can still add the ritual spell to your hand, so if you have another extender, you can keep going. But the most important part of this card is actually its secondary effect, where it's like a flu effect. So Flunderies has the most annoying field spell in that regard, where if your opponent normal or special summon, or specifically they normal summon, you can normal summon yourself. This is different where if your opponent normal or special summons, you can instantly ritual summon right on that position. This allows you to not play, to me the biggest problem has always been, and I'll get to it, Dynamundo. It sounds theoretically great, but Dynamundo plays into every single hand trap under the sun, as well as every bestial, and it hurts so bad to have happen to you. So I liked playing a bit of a different thing, where you would essentially hold this card. If you had a way to get to barrier, and you had this in hand, or a way to get to this, you would hold the trap, and you would go barrier for this, or this to help get you to barrier. And this would allow you to ritual summon during your opponent's turn, so you would either summon the card that draws 2, or you would summon Sephiris. But the most important part is for stuff like the Tenpai matchup. Tenpai, if you do this at the right timing, can't kill a monster in the battle phase without a certain effect, and most of the time they can't get to that effect. So a lot of times, even though your monster will be in attack position, if you pop the field spell, or if they activated Extravagance, they can't lethal you through this monster because they can't attack your low. They have to attack the monster. Now they have ways to play around this, like popping your continuous spells, but it's an extremely rare occurrence for Tenpai to get all the way to the battle phase with this play resolved, and then to be unscathed. Like, Tenpai picks up a lot of wear and tear along the way. Speaking of which, this is why this card right here is why I had confidence to make Tenpai go second so many times. Tenpai does not have a clean out for this trap card, because this trap card can either pop the field spell, it can pop the Tenpai monsters, or you can use it to constantly recur, like constantly just gaining advantage. Either way, if this card plus this card, because basically you'll send this card to the graveyard constantly and loop it back with the continuous spell to gain a non-stop series of pops every single turn. And that allows you to basically hold on against these really incredible decks like Snake Eyes, and sometimes, in some cases, Jubel in the grind game, which is normally a pretty hard thing for this deck to do. But the main thing that you would use this card for is to basically, you would go activate, I can't remember the name of the Tenpai field spell, and you would you would let them activate it. They would use its effect. It can only be used once per turn. You would immediately use this, sack it off to pop the field spell. Theoretically, Skull Guardian or any hand trap is enough to stop Tenpai from there if they have an extender. And the biggest problem I have with Tenpai is there's benefits to having such a small engine, and there are downsides. Downsides are, realistically, you only open one, max 2 pieces of that engine in an average hand. So I played to essentially be like, alright, if I out the field spell or out the normal, realistically it's unlikely they will find enough extenders to keep playing. And now we move on to the hand traps. For me, this was the biggest draw to playing this version of Voiceless Voice, was just the amount of hand traps you could get away with and consistently get access to. We play 3 of Nibiru. This is specifically for your Snake Eyes matchups. Nibiru is just so good into Snake Eyes that it's not really funny. Now, Snake Eyes can play through Nibiru to an extent, but a beaten up Snake Eyes board is enough for a Voiceless Voice board to kind of push through. And for me, that was where my real value was coming in. But Nibiru is always played because we play so many hand traps that most of the time Nibiru gets his best friend, Effect Veiler, or his best friend, let me see if I can find it real quick, 3 Imperm, or 2 Ghost Mourner. This allowed me to play essentially 8 copies of when a monster is special summoned, negate its effects. So this is something I wish I actually played 3 of, but I couldn't find the 3rd copy of. It was 9 cards theoretically that guaranteed that if you opened Nibiru, no board could play under it. Snake Eyes does not have a clean out to summon Appaloosa. You go this, they chain Appo, you chain Nibiru. They lose the Appaloosa. They do still have some things, but it's not a clean situation. Heaven forbid you have this and this, Effect Veiler or Imperm and Nibiru, because then Snake Eyes physically can't do anything to stop it. They're going to lose their board, and in a crippled state, Voiceless Voice most of the time will pick up that W. You play this many hand traps, specifically, we actually have 3 more. 3 Ash, but I'd like to explain Ash in a little bit more detail because of my actual opinions on the card. You play this many hand traps because Tenpai, Nibiru may not be useful against Tenpai, but actually all the other ones are. So Tenpai are only unaffected by their field spell, because if they have the field spell. Now realistically, Imperm's good either way, because you can Imperm them the moment they enter battle phase. It's not great, but it's still fine. The main reason I like these cards is they have to get to the field spell. And unless they hard opened Terraforming or 3 copies of the field spell, these cards will out whatever they normal. And that's just so valuable if you have your negates online, if you go first, which odds are is going to happen. So you have your Omni Negate for the field spell, you have any number of hand traps to stop the normal summon. The deck generally kind of crumbles under that weight of just trying to get as much advantage possible. Tenpai specializes off of getting little windows and punching in for lethal, but I wanted to basically make it to where they had a very hard time of finding them. I then played 3 copies of Ash Blossom. I actually don't like Ash Blossom against this a large part of the format pre-Legacy of Destruction. Ash Blossom was mainly used against Voiceless Voice or Branded, if you used it against Snake Eyes who were ashing Bonfire, or you were going to get a Hida summon and then they would go into a Promethean Princess play. So Ash Blossom by itself really didn't do enough to stop Snake Eyes, and that's why I generally relegated it to the side deck. But in the change of the format, I kind of anticipated Ash Blossom's pretty helpful against Tenpai because that lack of engine means they're more likely to only open 1 copy of it, so they have to search out more copies of the engine. Or if you're up against what I anticipated being the biggest thing around here at the moment was Branded, and with this many hand traps, Ash Blossom by itself doesn't cause a Snake Eyes player to pass turn, but Ash Blossom plus almost any other hand trap except maybe Nibiru will cause them to pass turn. The only reason why maybe Nibiru is if you Ash Branded or if you Ash Bonfire and then a normal Snake Eyes Ash, it doesn't change the ratio of math too much, but a lot of times that's not generally how it turns out. With all these decks playing such minimal engine, a large time what happens outside of exactly Snake Eyes is you'll Ash the starter, and that kind of just does a large amount of the work. Moving on from there, I actually am going to move on to the extra. We played 1 copy of Typhon. I didn't summon at all. Typhon was more so just a threat from any position for a lower diviner to turn into a lethal, or less of a lethal, but more of a obnoxious holding point against different decks. Generally, you don't summon this too often unless you already have access to the continuous trap. Then I would more inclined to summon this card. I then played 1 copy of our only synchro monster, which was our target for diviner. If we already opened the Triadja, you would go diviner, send either this or send Entis. This to search any ritual monster when it's sent to grave is just too valuable. Though occasionally there is a line where you will hard synchro summon this card using diviner and using another hand trap like Effect Veiler. Though reality it doesn't happen very often, and it's not Effect Veiler. What am I thinking? You would use Ash Blossom plus Low to turn into this card. It's very rare, but in some matchups it's pretty helpful to have that extra bit of negation as well as its semi-macro effect. We then played 2 copies of Dynamundo. I played Dynamundo ironically less for its revive a ritual effect and more so for its on-summon effect. Dynamundo being able to dodge a large amount of cards that have floating effects by shuffling a ritual into your deck and then shuffling a card your opponent controls into their deck allows you to play against Yubel on a very even footing. Because this deck has a problem in the main deck, there's not a clear way to out Yubel once they start looping if you don't already have the negate system online, which is hard to sometimes get access to. So you play Dynamundo so that you can shuffle it back into deck so it doesn't proc the floating effects. But Dynamundo is also helpful against Branded because you can dodge a large amount of their floating effects, and it is helpful against Snake Eyes depending on the situation they are. And if you are extremely greedy, and I'm very hesitant to say it, you can go Dynamundo Tribute itself to revive a ritual monster to proc the effect of low to get that third continuous card. But for me, you don't need to do that because it's super easy to get access to the continuous spell and the continuous trap. And it isn't until the third turn of your next turn, your second turn, where the continuous spell, the new one, really starts gaining value unless you know you're up against a Tenpai matchup. We play one copy of Relinquished so that you can basically just get low off the field so that you can go into a SP Little Knight play. This is in case you have 2 lows in rotation. One low goes into Relinquish, one low goes into SP Little Knight. SP will then banish a card, and you can get your resources set up from there. Just a very simple, thoughtful process. Sometimes Relinquished Anima eats a piece of material. Doesn't happen too often, but it does come up. We then play one copy of Dark Charmer. Light Charmer honestly should have been the pick, or maybe both of them. But at the time, I only had access to this one, and I was pretty confident that outside of me, there wasn't going to be too many other Voiceless players. I would say if you're bringing this deck to a big tournament, I would, instead of playing this next card, which is IP Masquerena, I would instead go Dark Charm, White Charm, and cut IP. IP really doesn't come up at all in this deck. I would also suggest cutting a couple other cards, theoretically, because my favorite line that I just did not use enough, and I honestly should have used during this tournament, was you would go into, I can't remember, what was the Link 3's name? You place spell counters on it.
Celine.
So you'd go into Celine using White or Dark Charmer, and then Celine, because you have all these continuous spells and these spells and graves, put 3 counters on it, and then you would special back, say, your effect failure or something, and this would allow you to go into an access code line. Very, very common play. I didn't do it during this tournament, but I regret not doing it. There was a couple times where I would have had a much easier lethal push if I had gone down that route. Then moving on to the rest of the pieces, these are what we like to classify as our Super Poly targets. Pretty simple. Outside of our Diviner send, we never Super Poly this, we just send this off Diviner to pop a card, pretty rare. These are the main cards. We play Garura, Dragostapalia, Loving Defender, and Starving Venom. Just, these pretty much hit everything you could hope they could hit. To me, Snake Eyes, having the Cyverse one is pretty mid at best. Snake Eyes can play through it really easily. I prefer Garura just to get a quick crack at the board and catch him off guard and get that draw. Dragostapalia for Branded, Loving Defender for Yubel, and Starving Venom for Rogue. And then the last card we played was Colossus, and that is in reference to a card we have in our side deck. Moving on to the side, we play 3 Super Poly. Pretty self-explanatory. In this deck, you have the extra deck space. You should side Super Poly. You don't want to main it, because a lot of decks can play through Super Poly, but having 3 of it in the side deck for those that can't, or for extra advantage against stuff like Tenpai, because Tenpai can't play through Super Poly efficiently, is too valuable. You play 3 Cosmic for Snake Eyes and for Tenpai. Snake Eyes, you banish the field spell that wipes the whole board, if they're playing the Fire King variant, and for Tenpai, you banish their field spell to make all their cards vulnerable, and for them to not get access to the rest of their engine. You play 2 Corridor because if you're pretty confident, you'll be able to get a card banished off of stuff like Severus. You can go into Corridor and then go into Colossus. I didn't like it too much because it felt win more when it did come up and was requiring me to already be in a position where I was most likely to win the game to summon. More testing with this, I probably wouldn't have gone with this route, but I do think I'm happy I tried it out, and maybe there is a way to make it more efficiently in the future. I then played 3 Ghost Spell and Haunted Mansion. I figured there was going to be a lot of rogue decks that this would be pretty helpful against. This is helpful against Kashtira because of Birth being the card they constantly use to keep gaining advantage. It's helpful to insulate your plays against Brandy because Brandy plays all those Magnamuts and stuff. So you can basically sequence your plays where even if they have the Magnamut, you can prevent your card from being banished by using Ghost Spell to protect low. We then play 3 copies of Evenly Matched. I actually regret playing this. This and some of the couple other cards did not come up enough. I think if you were to make this deck, I would go for a different hand trap that was more versatile than Evenly Matched, because it just never felt viable to bring in Evenly Matched. The decks it was good against wasn't nearly as good as Super Poly and other cards. It was only helpful against stuff like Labyrinth, and a lot of hand traps I would already side in instead of evenly matched against Labyrinth. We then play one copy of Odd Eyes Pendulum Dragon. I had a feeling there was going to be a lot of spell-related decks. This is pretty helpful to win time and win against Sky Striker players that I had a good read on were going to show up, as well as branded players because they activate Branded Fusion. You put this in Spell and Trap Zone, and Branded Fusion is turned off for the rest of the duel, because odds are you're going to OTK him after that. That's pretty much it for the main deck, side deck, and extra.
Any shout-outs you want to give?
I want to give big shout-outs to Elliot. I was unable to make this deck without him. A large number of the cards, because they never showed up to my house when I ordered them online. It was thanks to him I was able to get them in time for this event. I want to give big shout-outs to all the friends who also helped me get these cards, as well as the people who were willing to play test with me for large hours of the day to decide what variant of this deck I wanted to play.
All right. Well, everybody, that was our Voiceless profile. As always, we appreciate the support. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and we will see you guys in the next profile. Thank you.
All right, see ya.